Everyone, and welcome back to another edition of the Official Visit Podcast. I am Tyson Alger of the Oregonian, and I am joined by phone by my colleague Andrew Greif. And I think we got a pretty fun episode for you guys today. We're going to talk a little recruiting and a little bit of projecting forward with Royce Freeman. But first, we'll touch in with Andrew and touch basis with the second part of the podcast is going to be here today. Andrew?
Yeah, so we talked with Andrew Nemec, the Oregonian's recruiting specialist, because this was a pretty big weekend. There was only one commitment, I believe, from Alex Forsythe, the West Lynn, Portland area lineman. But I think what everyone's buzzing about was the offer extended to quarterback Tua Tagovailoa of Honolulu, St. Louis School, which, if you follow recruiting at all the last couple of years, you know that this guy is billed as Marcus Mariota's disciple. He's like this possible five-star quarterback in the same high school as Marcus Mariota's St. Louis School. So we dove pretty deep into that and kind of Oregon's recruiting status at large. Kind of are they progressing? Have things gotten a little bit better since the spring, which was really slow?
Cool, man. So what we'll do is we'll just basically tack that part on to the end of this podcast. But that's going to be an exciting part. I'm actually kind of pretty pumped for what we have for this one because as those of you who have been listening know, we've been kind of trying to come up with themes for some of these summer episodes because frankly, there's not a whole lot going on. And yesterday we were having lunch and Andrew suggested, how about we do a deep dive into whether or not Royce Freeman can be a legitimate Heisman candidate and whether or not he can reach 2,000 yards. He came close last season, coming in just above 1,800. But I think we did a little research, and let's have this out, Andrew.
Yeah, I think that let's tackle the 2,000-yard question first because that's the big kind of sexy stat that everyone associates with running backs. It's like it's not quite hitting 400 because it's been done a lot, but it's one of those kind of rare marks that is you're in part of an elite club if you rush for 2,000 yards. I think that Royce Freeman had a school record year last year, breaking Michael James' single-season rushing record, but it kind of went under the radar because of Oregon's struggles, and you have to figure that most 2,000-yard seasons, even if they're not on great teams, you still hear about those a lot.
Yeah, and I don't think either of us are necessarily going to argue with whether or not Royce Freeman has the talent to do this because he came within about 170 yards last season. He's obviously going to be one of the more talented running backs in the country this year. I think I think with some of these teams and there's 26 running backs that have rushed for 2,000 yards in the past. I think a lot of things have to kind of go your way in order for that to happen. And I think you saw that back with Michael James, who came awfully close himself, but he missed a game in 2011 when he had his career year. Yeah, in 2011, he played in 12 games and rushed for 1,800 yards. You play a 13th game there, he's got the chance to do it. So a lot of it depends on health, depends on how the team's doing, and just usage too.
Yeah. So one thing I think if I'm looking into the future, this isn't really a hot take, but I don't know if he gets there because Oregon is rebuilding the left side of its offensive line again, which it did last year. But I think the pieces this year, it's a different kind of rebuild, and we can totally talk about this if you want. But last year they brought back Tyler Johnstone at left tackle. They had a veteran center, albeit a new center, a transfer, in Matt Haggerty coming in. But he had 4 years of experience at Notre Dame. This year, the whole left side, it could be new. It could have a whole new left tackle, maybe Tyrell Crosby. You're going to have a new center, and I don't want to say likely, but I would say the favorite is going to be Jake Hansen, who himself is a redshirt freshman. So, I just don't know whether this line. You should never doubt Oregon's line. Steve Greatwood, they led the Pac-12 in rushing for 10 straight years. That speaks for itself. But whether or not this line is able to get him to 2,000 is a whole different question. And also, just look at the talent. They don't have to rush Royce Freeman every down. They don't have to be like Derrick Henry. They have so many options back there. I think that will eventually dilute how much Royce gets. So I think that, again, all the talent in the world, I don't know if it adds up completely to 2,000 just because of Oregon's wealth of other skill position
No,
talent.
I completely agree with you there because of the 26 players that have ever rushed for 2,000 yards, only 5 of them have done so with fewer than 300 carries. And Oregon has never had a 300 carry back in their history. The most carries they ever had was Michael James, 294. Last year, Royce had 283 carries, so he's close. But like you said, there's plenty of talent behind him, whether it's in Kenai Benoit, Tony Brooks-James, Taj Griffin, that I just don't, unless just everything kind of goes to heck and like you just have to pound Royce all season, I just don't see the Ducks needing to rush him 300 times a game when you do have kind of competent guys behind him that can spell him, because Royce is a big talent, but you definitely don't want to completely wear him out. Whereas like Derrick Henry last year when he rushed for 2,200 yards, he had 100 more carries than Royce did. He had 395, which is just a ton.
Yeah, and I think that Oregon is trying to put the people around Royce in better positions to be more effective. So you look at Taj Griffin. In the spring ball, when I talked to him, he was saying, he's one of the only guys I talked to in spring ball because I was mostly off. But he said that he was going to be playing a lot more slot in the fall as he expected to be, because he said, well, look, we have a guy like Royce back there. I don't need to be in the backfield all the time as a true running back. I mean, I think they'll experiment in ways to get him the ball, but he just thinks that this year it's probably more prudent, almost like Byron Marshall when Royce came in as a freshman. He can still be dangerous, but he doesn't have to be lining up next to the quarterback.
Right.
So I think they are kind of trying to maximize their resources and not just have this logjam behind him. That could lead to some more carries for Royce. But one other factor too, tell me if you agree with this. Last year set up really well because even though the quarterback play was spotty when it was running and Vernon Adams was playing well, there was a deep threat, stretch the field threat that at least right now Oregon I don't think really has. So you couldn't just put your safeties in the box if you're a defense, because Adams would throw over the top of you. When you're looking at Dakota Prukop and Travis Johnson, both untested guys at this level, I don't know if defenses will be that respectful, at least at the start.
Yeah, no, I agree. And if you look at last season, I would say Royce had his most consistent stretch when Vernon Adams was back in and healthy. Like if you take a look at that Washington game that Vernon Adams came back in, he rushed for 138 in that game, 110 the next week, 180 the next week, 105 the next week, 140. So basically, Freeman never rushed for fewer than 100 yards when Vernon Adams was healthy. Then again, the week before that Washington State game, when pretty much it was like Royce Freeman versus the Cougars, he did go for 246 yards. So there are a couple outliers there. But if you look at the Utah game when Oregon didn't have any pass threat, Royce only had 77 yards. The Michigan State game when Vernon Adams was banged up, he only had 92 yards. So I definitely think having that pass threat does help. But then again, also, some of those home run pass plays may have taken away, 3 or 4 carries from Freeman as well.
Yeah, I think that Oregon's rushing threat this year is going to be, regardless of the yardage, will be formidable again. It's just the way the world works, it seems like, with the kind of consistent year-to-year production. So I don't think there's any doubt that that Royce Freeman will get his yards and will surpass Michael James as the career yardage leader. I would think this year, but I should have looked up how far away he is from that.
So he's about 1,800 yards away. So he's one last season away from passing Nemec.
Okay. So it is within doubt then. I thought it was a little closer than that.
So LaMichael had 5,082 career rushing yards, and Royce Freeman is at 3,201 right now.
Okay, well, there we go. So it'll take a big season, a really big season. You can't just assume that because he's gone up in rushing the last 2 years, that this year you can kind of pencil him in for at least 1,700 yards. You just never know. LaMichael's own season showed that with his elbow injury the year after the national championship game. There's a lot of ifs out there, but I do think that Oregon's running game will be the primary driver of this offense. How much Royce gets of that, I'm not sure. And I think that the question that I got posed last night on Twitter, I kind of teased that we were going to be talking about Royce Freeman and how many yards he could get because let me back up, because Pro Football Focus, our friends there, they do really good in-depth stats, and so they put out a top 25 with the best player on the top 25 teams in their opinion. And Oregon came in at 21st, and which I think is fair. Good, but not elite this year. At least that's what most projections say. And Royce Freeman was their best player, which isn't a surprise. And they said that he's one of the most elusive backs according to their judgments, and is clearly one of the top backs in the country, even among a loaded running back class like Christian McCaffrey and Leonard Fournette. So I tweeted that hey, we're going to be talking about Royce in the morning. This is actually really good timing. And a follower of mine named Mike Julien, who is popular among Duck fans, he tweeted at me that, last year Royce basically by most national outlets, had a very quiet year, quiet 1,800 yards. And so it would take him, in Mike's kind of half-joking estimation, it'd take him like 2,500 yards to become a Heisman finalist. And so I was kind of curious, what would it take a running back to get to New York? So part 2 of our stats extravaganza today, after Tyson's his math this morning. So I looked up the last 5 years because I felt the last 5 years are pretty. One, it's just a nice kind of round number, and 2, I think it's representative of the era of football that's kind of taking over, where it's a lot of the same offenses, kind of the high-paced offenses, have come in the last 5 years. So I think it was a more representative sample. It's not like you're getting the ground and pound, right. 1970s USC, student body right. So basically, if you want to be a Heisman finalist, the last 5 years, you have to play on a good team. I think this is self-evident. Everyone knows that you have to play on a good team. But how good of a team do you need to play on? So the average is 11.6 wins and 2.1 losses a year. Do you, off the top of your head, Tyson, think Oregon could get to that in any kind of best-case scenario?
The only way Oregon's going to get to that is if Royce has like a 3,000-yard season.
And if Dakota Prukop or Travis Johnson is as advertised, and that means Prukop is a dual-threat stud, and Travis Johnson is an Elite 11 quarterback, and we should probably add Brady Hoke is a miracle worker on defense, like he's been billed at Michigan. Which
heck, stranger things have happened, but I would say that like all those things happening at once might be unlikely.
Yeah. Only in the last 5 years, only 2 finalists have gone to New York, and their team has not won at least 10 games.
And who was that, Andrew?
What's that?
And who was that?
Well, I don't actually remember one of them because I've been going through the stats like crazy. But one of them was a 7-win team, Boston College, and that was a 2,000-yard rusher, Tyson Alger. Oh, can you imagine?
Wow.
So that was Andre Williams. That was 2013. Just not a good team. But he did get, I believe, 2,177 yards and 18 touchdowns that year. So which gets me into a little more granular stats. So if you want to be a running back and get to New York City, what is the magic number, Tyson, would you think off the top of your head that for yardage in a season average? And this is, of course, includes games played after the Heisman ceremony.
Okay, so I'm just trying to think of some of the recent Heisman finalists. So you had Derrick Henry, probably Melvin Gordon.
Yes.
I'm going to guess probably about 2,200 yards.
Far lower.
Okay, far lower, sorry. 1956.
It's actually almost more than 200 yards less than that.
Really? Wow.
So to get to New York, according to my Microsoft Excel averaging skills, it will take 1,747 yards.
Okay.
That goes back. And this also doesn't account for, I had a question about quarterbacks who are dual threats, who are, almost as much as runner as quarterback. I didn't include them. I only included just pure running backs. So, for example, Jordan Lynch from Northern Illinois, about 2013, one of 6 finalists, by the way. I don't remember that, but there were 6 finalists that year. It went to New York, but he was not counted, even though he had a ton of yards on the ground.
Right.
So this is just pure running backs. Now, touchdowns, you have to average 22 touchdowns.
Okay.
I don't remember what Royce had last year.
Royce had 17 rushing touchdowns last year.
Okay. I believe this was total touchdowns.
Okay, so he had two receiving touchdowns. And I guess, didn't he throw for one last year, too?
He did. Actually, let me contradict myself. I believe this is just rushing touchdowns because Christian McCaffrey's total in the stats thing I'm looking at Sports Reference, which is kind of like a Bible for stats.
Right.
They list McCaffrey last year as only having 8. And of course, he had many more than that. So this was just 8 rushing.
Okay.
So here's the thing, though. Of those running back finalists the last 5 years, there are 7 of them. It's actually, there's a higher bar for them to get there, for their team success. Those running backs have played on teams that average 12 wins a year. And what's fascinating about that is that average takes into account the 7-win season by Andre Williams of Boston College. So it really should be even higher than that if you had a run-of-the-mill average type season, of 10 or 11 wins. It should be even higher. So I think maybe that speaks to maybe a bias that we have toward running backs. Maybe we think that they have to have far higher stats, far better stats, more eye-popping stats than quarterbacks or something. Or maybe it's just that they always happen to play on good teams. I don't know, but that's a high bar to get to.
All right, so you think he gets to that?
I think he could absolutely get to the yardage and the touchdowns. I don't think that's a question. 1,747 yards is the average Heisman finalist yards per season. I think he can get to that, no problem. He obviously has before.
So I was just going to say, so essentially it kind of sounds like we both agree on Royce Freeman's Heisman candidacy. He isn't going to be completely reliant upon his own self. It's going to have a lot to do with how Oregon does as a team.
Exactly. And I think we saw that last year where, prior to the season, he was on many, many watch lists. I want to say a half dozen watch lists for Maxwell, Doak Walker, you name it. And then after September, after the Washington State loss when Oregon had 3 losses, you just never really heard about Royce again in the national context, other than people in late November, usually from inside the athletic department, saying, "Hey, Royce, look at him. He's having a really good year." I think you just kind of get lost in the conversation unless your team is also doing well. So that's kind of that was our general, I think, thesis early on in this podcast. Was we think he can get the numbers, but it's going to take more than that. It's going to take a perfect storm, like it always does to be a Heisman finalist. But it's just going to be really, really tough.
And it's just, you can be so good all season, and one bad game can kind of completely derail you. I mean, I think for, the first 2/3 of last season, everyone was way on like the Leonard Fournette train. He was rushing for almost 200 yards a game and all that stuff, and then he only has 31 against Alabama.
Right.
And then just an absolutely terrible 91 yards the next week. And, that just goes to show you how hard it is to rush for 2,000 yards, because I think everyone would assume Fournette was way on that train, and he just finished with 1953 last year.
Exactly.
And on 300 carries, which was obviously more carries than Royce got.
Right. So it's gonna be very tough. But Freeman, if you were to do it in a vacuum, he has every good shot in the world to do it. But it takes more than that.
Correct. Well, I think we've kind of kicked the tires enough on that one. Do you want to transition into part 2 of this podcast?
Yeah. So this is our conversation with Andrew Nemec. We talked about Tua Tagovailoa, Oregon's recruiting in general, and I thought it was a pretty good conversation. So let's switch over to that one.
School football related. Okay, so we want to talk about the big elephant in the room. Roll Tide, pun intended. Tua Tagovailoa.
You said it right.
I said it right. We did, before we taped this podcast, we did like 10 minutes of research to make sure we got the last name pronunciation right. He's a 5-star quarterback?
4-star
five-star?
quarterback. I think in this class there are so few 5-stars right now that there's a possibility he moves into that group. But generally people see him around the mid-50s overall, so he's going to have to really shine in the Elite 11 to move up. And if he is, there's an opportunity to be that 5-star if he's an MVP of the Elite 11, but it's probably going to take that to get that 5th star.
Sure. Okay, so we'll get to him in just a second. First off, though, just big picture Oregon football recruiting. There's been some activity the last, I would say, 2 weeks or so. Oregon Ducks now have 5 commits in the 2017 class. Of course, these are all verbal. Nothing's binding until February. But 3 have come in the last couple weeks. What, in light of those commitments recently, kind of what's your view? Has it changed? What's your view on Oregon recruiting? Because you had been down on them for legitimate reasons, but does that change where the Ducks stand now? Any momentum?
No, I don't think it changes a whole lot. I think if we talk about momentum, which is kind of you never really know because kids could be close to committing and they could be waiting. But what I had written was that 2016 didn't end the way they wanted it to. In some rankings, they ended outside the top 25. I think it's fair to say it didn't end the way they wanted to. On signing day, they went 0 for 5 with the blue chip commits that we're choosing. And then Vavai Malapai flips, obviously the U.S. Army All-American running back, flips from Oregon to USC. They end up without a running back in the class. They're set at running back. At the same time, there was a reason they wanted to bring him in. He flips. That hurt them. And they did start slow in the class of 2017. I don't think they're necessarily cleaning up in the state, in their home state, the way they would want to. But I've always said I thought there was good potential for this class to be a very good class. Now, originally that was built on a foundation of Ryan Kelly. Perhaps now it's going to be built on a foundation of Tua Tagovailoa.
Yeah, definitely. So let's talk about him more. So he was a guy, St. Louis school, alma mater of Marcus Mariota, of course, in Honolulu. For a couple years now, he's been pretty open about would love to follow in Marcus's footsteps. That's something you talked about with him early on in his recruitment.
Yeah, Marcus, when he was in high school, really took Tua under his wing more so than the other kids. I think Tua showed some glimpses of being a big-time quarterback. And it's not like, Hawaii's Texas where they produce 10 or 15 4-star kids at all times. Tua looked like a special kid even as a 4th or 5th grader, but he was still kind of the youngest guy out there. So Marcus worked with him a couple times. I think he took him to McDonald's and they got, fries and a shake or whatever. But he gave him a ride home a couple times. And they really bonded. And early in Tua's career, when I first talked to Tua, he had offers from USC, UCLA, and Hawaii. And I called him and was like, hey, I've heard, Marcus kind of taught you. And that was right around the time Marcus was a Heisman finalist. I don't think he'd won it quite yet. And Tua just said, yeah, and I love him, and if I could go to Oregon, I would love to go to Oregon. Well, when a sophomore from Hawaii is seen as a potential 5-star prospect and they're saying, I want to follow in Marcus's footsteps, I know my recruitment's exciting, but really my only goal is to go to Oregon, that really caught my attention. So I wrote about him. Early in his career, I don't think he thought there was any chance he would go anywhere else, and he even said, I don't really see myself really being interested in the recruiting process, to be honest with you. As soon as I get my offer from Oregon, I'm ready to be done. I want to be the next Marcus Mariota.
Yeah, and now he's committed, I should say, to Alabama. That was fairly recently, I want to say within the last couple months.
It was a day after Ryan Kelly decommitted or a day before Kelly decommitted. So it was right in that timeline of things. And then, of course, Tate Martell, Tua Tagovailoa, and Ryan Kelly all kind of have this history together sort of tied with Oregon. It feels like it's Game of Thrones quarterback style. Oregon offers Ryan Kelly. He commits. Tate Martell and Tua have both publicly prior to that said, I want to go to Oregon. I'd like an offer from Oregon.
Yeah.
Ryan Kelly decommits. Tua commits. Tate decommits at the time from Texas A&M, all within a span of about 48 hours. Then when Oregon offered Tua, the next day, Tate Martell committed to Ohio State. So these quarterbacks are all tied together, and it's going to be fun regardless of where they all end up to watch kind of the politics of quarterbacking and really how this class plays out for Oregon. I would imagine they hope to get one of those at some point, but those three forever are going to be tied together with Oregon fans as like, we could have had this guy, we maybe could have had this guy, and we did have this guy. How do they all pan out?
And in the case of Kyler Murray, another guy who a couple years ago people thought might be an Oregon Duck late in the process before he decided, just because he goes somewhere that freshman year, you never know. With high-rated quarterbacks, they are liable to transfer pretty quickly. Maybe it's just an A&M thing. I don't think it. Obviously,
it definitely is an A&M thing, but it could be. It's wider spread than
you never know.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of it is with this Elite 11 stuff, and what you're seeing is these quarterbacks being billed as program savers, program changers from day one. Jacob Eason, I believe, at the spring game for Georgia threw a couple nice balls and people went, hey, he might start. And he really, truly might start. But I think these kids get in their heads, I'm a program saver. Trent Dilfer's told me I'm the most improved quarterback, as you said earlier when we were talking off the pod. Trent Dilfer sometimes will say, this kid's the best kid, the most improved kid we've seen in 2 weeks. And they get this idea like, hey, I'm going to come in and be a starter right away. And college football's tough. And the class before you, 2 classes before you, there are 4 and 5 stars in a lot of programs. Mm-hmm. These kids go to Alabama, LSU, Ohio State thinking they're going to play from day one. It doesn't work out and they look elsewhere. I think we're seeing a lot more decommitments, a lot more transfers, particularly at quarterback, than we've ever seen before.
Yeah, I remember last year at Pac-12 Media Days in July, that was like a big talking point. It was almost like, I don't know if the coaches were like intentionally throwing shade at these high-rated quarterbacks who transfer early in their career, but there was a lot of talk from Arizona State's Todd Graham about Mike Bercovici, about how proud he was that he stayed for 5 years before he really got his first shot to really take over a team from the beginning of the season. Helfrich was talking about Jeff Locke, about how just like, hey, whatever happens, I'm just really proud that a guy has stuck it out, even though we put him through the ringer with not knowing what he's going to be doing. And so I thought that was interesting. Like they made their point very clearly that we think it's a shame people just up and leave at the first sign of competition or conflict or an obstacle. We wish more guys would stick it out because we think it's worth it.
And I think that's now played out in the culture of high school sports. You're even seeing kids, and we've seen some this summer in Oregon, transfer because they feel like their recruiting situation with a coach might be better somewhere else, or they feel like they might get playing time earlier somewhere else. That kind of stuff is just kind of part of sports culture now, and it's really too bad. So these kids have grown up with, well, hey, I don't play, even in AAU basketball 7-on-7, whatever it is, I'm not the starting quarterback or receiver on my 7-on-7 team. I'm going to go to this other team where I can play right away. And that seems to be playing out now at the college level, and kids are giving up eligibility. It's ruffling the scholarship situation. It's a really disappointing and really negative, I think, trend in amateur athletics.
Okay, so since Oregon has offered Tua, this has been about 3 days ago, over the weekend, it was reported out of Honolulu first. Do you get a sense from commenters or people tweeting at you of the reaction? Are people like, wow, this is way too late, or hey, better late than never? We're excited. Like, what's the spectrum you're seeing from fans?
Well, I think there's two factions of Oregon recruiting fans in general. There's the eternal optimists who are like, hey, Oregon's been to 2 national championship games. We are going to be there again in the next year or two. It's inevitable. We have the best facilities, Phil Knight, Nikes, check out our shoes. And then you've got the other group that says, the second half of the Alamo Bowl was embarrassing. The sky is falling. We keep having these senior so
the Eeyore group.
Yes, the Eeyore group. And I think realistically it's probably somewhere in the middle, right? But that's the reaction I get. I get people who say, why did it take so long? And I think there's a legitimate question there. And the other side is, finally we offered this kid, Marcus. What if Marcus gets involved and calls him and says, hey, come to Oregon? What happens then? And I think Oregon does have a shot with him. I know 24/7 Sports recruiting expert for Oregon, Justin Hopkins, does a great job over there. I know he's predicted that Tua will flip and end up at Oregon. I don't see it. I'm not ready to make that leap quite yet, but I think Oregon's in the mix, and I wouldn't shock me at all to find out Tua was going to take a visit to USC, going to take a visit to Oregon. He said he's going to take visits. Mm-hmm. If Oregon's not on that list, I'd be surprised. So I think Oregon gets a visit at least, and we'll kind of see from there. But that's the two factions. Is like, we're getting him, this is great, and what took so long, he hates us. I mean, it's a funny dichotomy between those two.
So I know you haven't. Tua hasn't been talking to a whole lot of people recently. So I'm not.
Except in person, he's willing to talk at camps. He's a little bit harder to get a hold of on the phone.
So from your perspective, then, knowing that you haven't been able to talk to him in the immediate kind of recent past,
sure.
What's your sense for kind of why it took so long? If you had to not just guess, but
sure.
just kind of whether it's informed or anything you're hearing, or just kind of what took so long.
Well, you're hearing a lot of things, and the rumors range from academics to a number of other things. But you have to believe that at least Scott Frost had Ryan Kelly higher on his board than Tua. Otherwise, there's no issue to begin with, right? If Scott Frost, Coach Frost, wanted to offer Tua, he just would have done it. So there's at least that now with Frost being at Central Florida and Yost being in, and Yost being an evaluator of quarterbacks, and the options, frankly, drying up. There's only 3 quarterbacks in the ESPN 300 that are still uncommitted. Oh, okay. So there aren't very many options available. That with the options available, Yost says, hey, Tua's now the best guy on the board. The other thing is Oregon's been slow to offer, particularly quarterbacks, and they've just kind of had a hardline rule that they're pretty unwilling to offer quarterbacks when they're sophomores. And I understand that a lot can change in a quarterback's development from sophomore to senior year. Not necessarily more than any other position, but certainly there can be a massive jump, and I get that. But quarterbacks are committing earlier and earlier, and we're seeing, at last year's Elite 11, I think there were 18 quarterbacks, all but 2 were committed. This year, I believe there's 12 right now, and there may end up being more. But I think all but 1 is committed. So yeah, and they're they haven't started their senior seasons yet. They're still juniors. Right. So quarterbacks are committing earlier and earlier. Oregon wants to wait a little bit, and I think that's part of it too. Is Tua grew impatient a little bit as a sophomore, saying, "Why hasn't Oregon offered?" And Oregon just said, hey, you got like 2.5 more years of school left.
Do you have your license yet to it?
Right.
Yeah, we'll get back to you.
And I think, I think people say, well, what took so long? Well, he's been known about for a long time, but in terms of what took so long, he's still a junior in high school. Now, he may have technically, I guess, finished school already in Hawaii. I don't know exactly if school's out yet, but he's only a junior in high school. He still has a full year of school left. People who are saying, like, I can't believe it took so long. I get that. I genuinely do. At the same time, before people say, what, there's no time left. We've got a whole senior season left. Imagine what you thought between your junior year and the time you graduated as a senior. Your life view changed quite a bit. Imagine what it would be for a football player with a whole season and watching things play out on the college football landscape.
Right. There was I've seen some speculation like, because Alabama recently picked up a second quarterback commit in Mac Jones, who was a different type of quarterback entirely. Maybe that forced to his hand. Maybe that made him less keen on going or sticking out his Alabama commitment. Again, if you had to kind of venture into that topic, do you think having talked to Tua early and knowing, I'm guessing he's a pretty competitive guy,
competitive kid for sure. Yeah.
Do you think that really would be a factor for him?
Well, he was interviewed about it and publicly said at least that he had no issue. He welcomes the competition. I don't know about you. Me personally, I want one less quarterback to worry about at Alabama because that means another 4 or 5 star kid. So while he can say that publicly, we really don't know. Is that the right thing to say? Absolutely. And you have to give him kudos for saying the right thing publicly. But there's a chance that, behind closed doors, he's like, man, that's one more quarterback to compete with. That's, I wanted to have the job a little sooner. Now I have to compete. But again, at least publicly, he's saying the right thing. He said that's not a factor.
Sure. Okay. Let's go back one last time for kind of the Marcus Mariota factor here. I think that's huge. I think people think that's kind of the ace card that Oregon has to play here is, you could be the next Marcus. We have this pipeline. They've done really well in Hawaii with the Forest, with all these guys. You could step into that role. Do you think that kind of mystique holds appeal to Tua enough to make him ready to commit?
Well, he's not. I don't think it's going to be enough single-handedly to make him ready to commit, but I think it's enough to make him interested. It was incredible talking last year to recruits, and whether they picked Oregon or not, just talking to recruits in general about the view in Hawaii of Oregon. And there are a lot of Oregon Duck fans in Hawaii. I mean, that's kind of almost their home school. The way they talk, coaches just say the kids grow up dreaming of playing. The defensive linemen all want to be the next DeForest Buckner. The quarterbacks all want to be the next Marcus. I think it's going to play a factor. It's just similar to like when a kid says, I want to look at somewhere else, and then they're an in-state kid in Oregon, and everybody around them is a Duck or Beaver fan, and they're all like, hey, are you going to Oregon? We can watch your game. Hey, I'm going to get tickets to see you play. That kind of thing goes on a little bit in Hawaii, too, where it's like, how cool would it be if you went to Oregon? That's going to be in his ear. And not only that, but he feels that way a little bit. I mean, he did grow up saying, the only thing I care about is following in Marcus's footsteps. Now, he can feel like he was slighted. He wasn't given that opportunity early enough. But if that's really truly his passion, that seems like a small gripe. Like you didn't offer me as a high school sophomore, but you did as a high school junior. But my dream was to play for you, but that 1 year was enough to get me. I don't buy that. I think if your dream growing up is to play for a school and you just feel like they offered you 6 months later than you would have liked, you're going to get over that if that truly is your dream. So I think Oregon's got a shot, and I think the number of people around him that say, hey, Oregon's pretty cool, Oregon's the place to be, is enough that he's probably going to visit.
Sure. Okay, 2 more things. Alex Forsyth, West Lynn, offensive lineman, 4-star, I think he's Oregon's last commit over the weekend, most recent. Does that hold any sway with Elijah Molden?
It could. Elijah's his own man, though. I mean, I think bottom line, what it's going to come down to for Elijah, because I think, again, going back to answer your question directly, I would think following in his dad's footsteps, potentially, if he's going to be swayed by one individual, I would tend to think it would be his dad over an offensive lineman.
I don't want to come out too much that it was only going to be Forsyth bringing it out, but do you think that
they're buddies?
Yeah,
they're buddies. It's a factor, but I think Elijah's been pretty steadfast in, like, he's realistic. Like, I am a good, he knows he's a good corner. He's technically sound. He's got good footwork, amazing hips. He's good. His 40 time isn't elite, but everything else about him is potential NFL down the road. He wants to go someplace where he can learn and develop, and he's really realistic about. Oregon's defense was atrocious last year. He's pretty open about that. So he said, I want to see what Brady Hoke brings to the table. He is one of those fall, wait, and see kids. I think there are a number of them on the defensive side of the ball that say, let's see what Brady Hoke draws up before I commit to a future in Eugene. He's one of those. And I think if he sees significant improvement from Oregon's defense as a whole, but particularly that secondary, he'll commit to Oregon. If he doesn't, if he looks and says, man, this doesn't look fun to play in, I'm sitting back, we're real conservative, I don't get to really get my hands on anybody, he's going to go to Stanford probably. And I think it's that simple. Forsyth's commitment helps because it's a teammate. It's another person in his ear saying, go to Oregon. Chris Miller was a quarterback at Oregon. He's the head coach. His dad was a star at Oregon. He's there. So there's a lot of Oregon influence with Elijah. But I think it really is close to a coin flip right now between them and Stanford.
And if people they know names like Molden and Tua, but they don't necessarily know the whole landscape of Oregon recruiting. If you were to look at the 2017 class, are there like a couple definite needs in this class that Oregon must get position-wise? They just have to recruit strong at here or here.
Well, tight end's the big one. They've got 3 senior tight ends, Johnny Munt, Farrell Brown, and Evan Bayless.
Right.
So they need to get at least one tight end, and they're looking really good right now at that position. Moses Robinson Carr is only a 3-star prospect, but he's got a top 5, and he's got offers from all of them. It's Oregon, Oregon State, Tennessee, UCLA, and USC. Not a bad top 5.
Right.
Told me 2 days ago that Oregon stands out right now as the leader, and he's deciding in a month. He just got back from a visit from Oregon not too long ago, this spring. And I think Oregon's in the driver's seat. Now, he's from California, and just like we talked about with Tua, just like we talked about with Elijah Molden, when you get people in your ear being like, hey, it'd be cool if you stayed with the home state school, that tends to, over time, kind of erode your excitement about an out-of-state school. Mm-hmm. But as of right now, Oregon. Josh Fallow, great tight end, really talented, high 4-star player. Some people see him as a potential 5-star even because he's so athletic. He's got Oregon in the mix. And then Trey McKitty just got back from a visit this weekend. He's from IMG Academy, the number 1 high school in the country in terms of producing prospects. That's in Florida. So it's a long trip. But really liked Oregon, really loved his visit, and those 3 are all extremely talented. If they could get 1 or 2 of those, that would really help the class because, like we just said, with 3 senior tight ends, they need somebody to come in. And all 3 of those guys are good enough they could probably play pretty early.
Yeah. On the recruiting calendar, the big thing is the opening coming to Nike's headquarters in Beaverton in early July. After that, season starts, official visits begin, and it gets real interesting real fast. And, of course, then before we know it, it's signing day. It's so much of a blur how quickly it seems to go from opening to closing in some ways.
No, you're right. And really for me, and we do this 7-on-7 stuff, and there's been a real in-state focus for me the last few months to really make sure I have that down before we get into the fall and I really shift my attention more to Oregon State, because I have to have the Oregon stuff down because I don't Oregon high school kids down because I don't get as much time in the fall as I would like to.
Sure.
So really things start to shift into Oregon State focus mode at that opening. And so I'm really excited to kind of hit the accelerator with both those programs and really get a deeper understanding of them as I have already now with the class of 2017 in the state of Oregon.
Definitely. Thank you.
Thank you, man. Appreciate it.